You ever seen one of those old laws and then thought to yourself, what sequence of events had to happen to make this necessary? For example, in South Dakota, it's illegal to fall asleep in a cheese factory. In Alabama, bear wrestling matches are prohibited. In my home state of Arizona, it's illegal to trip a horse on purpose. And right here in Oregon, one may not bathe unless they are wearing suitable clothing, meaning covered from shoulder to knee. These are all pretty weird, and there's more for each of these states and all the other states. I mean, seriously, why do these need to be laws? Frank's showering and I know he's naked and I can't handle it. Okay, yes, at some point these laws were relevant, but today they're outdated and totally unnecessary. They've technically stayed laws because they just became irrelevant and nobody thought to take them out. And of course, this isn't only true for state laws. What about the Bible? Look, whether we want to admit it or not, there are some weird laws in the Bible. Like don't wear clothing made from two fabrics. Polyester cotton blend. Dang it. Or don't boil a goat in its mother's milk. Or if two men are fighting and one of the men's wife wants to defend him, so she grabs his opponent's... You know what, I'll just let you look that one up yourself. Seeing these kinds of laws can get people asking the question, is the Bible still relevant to us today? The books of the Bible were all written thousands of years ago, and yet we Christians still rely on them to guide our faith. But should we? Is the Bible still relevant? Look, the easy answer is yes, of course it is, but we're obviously not going to leave it at that, so let's dive in. If we're going to talk about how relevant the Bible is to Christians today, it's best to separate this into Old Testament and New Testament. I'll do a whole video on this someday, but to kind of put it plainly, the Old Testament is not the law that Christians are meant to follow. The Old Testament had a purpose, but when Jesus died on the cross and then rose from the grave, he fulfilled that purpose. Think of it like this. Your car gets a flat tire, so you got to pull over, take off the flat, and put on a donut. If you've never heard of a donut tire before, it's like a spare tire that's not meant to be permanent. It's just to tide me over. Now that donut tire is absolutely necessary. You're not going anywhere without it. But the purpose of the donut tire is just to get you by until your permanent tire is ready. In the same way, the Old Testament law existed to bridge the gap between us and God, but only until the Messiah, Jesus, arrived. So while the Old Testament is fantastic for history and poetry and wisdom and so many other things, the truth is that it's not our law anymore. This is basically what Jesus meant when he said he didn't come to abolish the law, meaning it was bad and get rid of it, but to fulfill the law, meaning he now serves the purpose of the law. We also see Paul writing that we've been released from the law through Christ and that we actually have a new law under Christ. So as far as the Old Testament law goes, no, it's not meant to apply to us Christians today. But it's still so important to see why God made these laws, what the culture was like when these laws were made, the history surrounding the laws. The Old Testament has poetry and prophecy and wisdom and so many other good things. So sure, that law isn't our law anymore, but there is still so much that Christians can learn from the Old Testament. And the New Testament is absolutely something Christians should follow. Time has not changed that fact. Now, of course, it's important to understand everything in its original context, but the message within that context is still totally applicable to us today. This is because the overall law of the New Testament is just to love people selflessly. Jesus says that the whole law can be summed up in loving God and loving others. Paul writes specifically that love is fulfilling the law. And Paul writes elsewhere that the whole law can be summed up in one phrase: love your neighbor as yourself. Of course the Bible is still relevant to us today because no matter how much time passes, love is always relevant. So sure, some of those Old Testament laws might seem weird and they were specific for their time, but there's still so much value in the Old Testament that we can learn as Christians today. And the New Testament is filled with the history of our church and guidance on how to love people. Yes, the Bible is still relevant to us today because love will never be irrelevant.